Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Solana, and I'm the editor of Mozilla's Internet Health Report. Today, we're here to talk about the algorithmic role that internet companies will play in elections around the world this year. And there will be so many elections in the Philippines, Colombia, Kenya, Brazil, just to name a few. And by now, you're aware of the impact that social media has on politics in your own country. And now imagine what is being spread and amplified all over the globe. Do big tech companies have everything under control? What are the threats to the global information ecosystem that are heading our way? Joining me for this discussion is Odanga Madung, who is a journalist and Mozilla Fellow from Kenya. We had Mohammed Najim, who is the executive director of SMEX, a major digital rights organization in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we also have Samantha Bradshaw, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Stanford University, working at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So we have a lot to talk about here. One last thing, we're taking questions for this panel in real time. This is live. Tweet them at Mozilla Festival with the hashtag Dialogues and Debates, or if you're watching on the MozFest Plaza on the MozFest website or Vimeo, you can also use the chat function to add your questions right there. So I'm going to start with a question for Samantha, and then also quickly drop in a fact about Facebook that tends to surprise people. And that is that the three countries with the most Facebook users in the world are India, the United States, and Indonesia, followed by Brazil and Mexico, in case you didn't think that people were using social media everywhere in the world. So to Samantha, what are the disinformation tactics that we can expect to see around the world this year?
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Solana, and for the great starting question. I think disinformation has really become endemic to elections. There isn't going to be a single election that's free from disinformation and these coordinated efforts to manipulate voters. And while every country is really different in terms of its socio-political context, I think there's several trends that we can identify about the different tactics used in these campaigns. The first trend that I want to point out is the continuing rise of the influence industry, which I think is best illustrated by what's going on in the elections in the Philippines right now. To give a little bit of brief background, the Philippines is currently going through a really contentious electoral battle with 5 front-running candidates. And, with the ongoing COVID pandemic, that's put a lot of pressure on this election. I think only 30% of the population there is vaccinated. And social media is incredibly important to Filipino society. Over 90% of Filipinos are online, and 81% of these are on Facebook. Incredibly important source of news, and people trust social media more than they tend to trust local news. And so when we're looking at this case, I think it's really important to recognize that trolls have really become endemic to the Philippines. The tactics that we saw Duterte using in 2016, which involved hiring an army of trolls to flood the information ecosystem with pro-Duterte content while simultaneously undermining his opposition, was really just the start. And these strategies have continued to intensify. The influence industry has continued to support paid trolls on behalf of candidates. And this really includes both fake accounts, but also real people, including social media influencers who are often paid to support and amplify candidates. In terms of other trends we're seeing around the world, I think the second important trend that I'd like to point out really has to do with the narratives that we see emerging around and during elections. And there are 2 really important things here. The first is the way that identity, history, and culture are weaponized by trolls, by coordinated inauthentic actors to to spread disinformation both further and farther, and the way that these narratives can impact marginalized communities in uneven ways. What I mean here is, racism, sexism, xenophobia, misogyny. These ideas are commonly used in disinformation campaigns now to fracture social cohesion, foment polarization, and really suppress minority or marginalized groups from political speech and participation. So disinformation is not only about, spreading fake news or false messages, but they're really coordinated efforts to weaponize identity politics and manipulate elections. I think this is really important for our panel on AI and algorithms, because algorithms tend to amplify content that generates engagement. All these negative emotions are things that have been measurably shown to get people engaged: fear, anger, hatred. These really deep-rooted emotions get people typing, get people clicking on, like buttons, angry emotions, so on and so forth. But just because something generates engagement doesn't mean that it's good for democratic deliberation. Finally, the last trend that I want to point to around narratives is that we need to think about not just what happens before and during an election, but what happens in the ecosystem after an election. I think there have been growing concerns that elections will be continue to be delegitimized by candidates that don't win an election. There might be conspiracy theories that undermine the integrity of the electoral process, or even premature claims to victory, which can, ultimately lead to, in worst case scenarios, political violence. The 2020 US presidential elections is an easy example that comes to mind, but we've also seen premature claims to victory lead to political violence in countries like Mexico during their 2018 gubernatorial elections. So paying attention to these narratives and what happens after an election is also important, because it reminds us that disinformation doesn't die when an election is over. It's something that's ongoing. And I think it also points to the important role of elites here. Politicians and news organizations, for example, are really responsible for amplifying a lot of these messages. So it's not just fake accounts, it's not just these fake accounts or, real people kind of from the bottom up promoting these campaigns, but the role of elites and their dominance in like algorithmic systems, the way that they have large audiences and can get their messages to a large number of people. It really matters when it comes to disinformation narratives and making them stick.
Thanks, Samantha. Mohammed, in the Middle East, what are some of the things that you have seen through your research, and what are you concerned about?
Hi, Solana. Hi, everyone. When it comes to the elections in the Middle East, we really need to discuss the ecosystem in each country, because everyone thinks that the Middle East is only like one country or one ecosystem, but there's really a lot of dynamics. There's a lot of different contexts. For example, Tunisia used to be one of the best democracies in the region until basically recently, when the president just did a coup. He suspended the parliament and is calling now for a new referendum. And also, meanwhile, he's trying to control the judiciary and is changing the civil society laws, etc. So Tunisia, as an example, this has been supported by a lot of misinformation campaigns, and from like changing the Facebook, famous Facebook pages names to other names and start talking politics. Pages who used to handle sports or cooking, they're starting spreading messages for the president. It is actually an interesting example when it comes to Tunisia. So we have seen all this misinformation happening, but we can't really put our fingers. I mean, I'm not sure if others managed to do that on some specific disinformation and who's really behind it. So there's still a lot to do when it comes to this country, because as Samantha says, like this is ongoing process, and it started before the elections and it continues after the elections. So because some elections supposed to happen soon, we assume that that this is only going to increase. When it comes to, for example, to Lebanon, which is, we also have two different elections this year. One is parliamentary, another is presidential. I mean, Lebanon is kind of like quasi the democratic state. We're witnessing now a big economical collapse. And we started witnessing some misinformation campaign, but we don't see really anything serious like Tunisia. Sudan is also another example where it has been living under dictatorship for so many years. When the last dictator al-Bashir stepped down in April 2019, the situation has been controlled from like military. It has like a short period of time where there was like civilian government, but still like it's the situation is not stable, and there's a lot of focus and support for the dictatorship military forces by Egypt, by the Gulf states, specifically Saudi Arabia and UAE. There are a lot of cases of disinformation that has been exposed by Twitter, by Facebook in the summer or late of 2019. So we're also estimating that this is also going to increase specifically now. And we're not really sure about the tech companies. I mean, tech companies, I mean, they usually don't care about the region unless there's a disaster that they need to deal with. Those were the words of the Facebook lead in the MENA policy between like 2014 and 2017, Ashraf Zaytoun, when I hosted him during Bread and Net. But I feel like in the last couple of years, we have seen they're trying to understand and they're trying to put more resources. We're not sure yet why these companies are not putting a lot of resources before that. So maybe he's right, like they're just waiting for a disaster to happen to actually deal with it. And now there are some conversation happening about these issues when it comes to like misinformation, disinformation, and the countries where there are elections happening. So those are just like a brief context about the region and what's happening.
Thank you. And I guess we'll keep flying south. And Odanga, what are some of the elections or contexts that you've there you are. What are some of the elections and contexts that you're concerned about in the Sub-Saharan Africa region?
Hey everyone, thanks a lot, Solana. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I think, of course, I think just taking a cue from Mohammed, in terms of the phrase that he said that, you know, the Middle East is not a country. I think if there's one region that has often been bundled up into one country, you know, it's Africa. Africa is definitely not a country. And one thing is, when I look in terms of the elections that we have coming up this year, we've got elections in, I think, around 9 countries in Africa, predominantly East Africa, a bit of the Sahel region, and Francophone West Africa having majority of the elections that are happening this year. Now, in terms of when I look at the broad sense of the trends that we are worried about in terms of disinformation and AI reform, the big deal here is just, let's start from the fact that many of these American and Chinese big tech companies simply have completely neglected taking care of the algorithm, or rather have neglected to pay attention to the damage that the algorithms can cause in a more broader context, and completely lack the cultural context and local nuances in order to be able to moderate these specific, these algorithms and the kind of harms that they are able to cause within the jurisdictions that they operate. It's a wonder how, you know, many of us actually let them get away with these kinds of things, because I can imagine if someone from America in the Bay Area came and set up a factory in my neighborhood and kept churning out smoke into my kitchen. And I let him just walk away with all the money that and he's going to make money and send it back home. And somehow we are not thinking that there's a problem with that, and he's not also doesn't think there's a problem with that, then definitely there is something wrong with this model that we need to think about. And I think the second thing that I would point to is around, again, when we think about AI reform, is just the fact that in terms of paying attention, the recent revelations about the kind of conditions that African tech workers, specifically the content moderators of these companies, are facing, and the fact that that in turn contributes to the kind of effects that we see algorithms, or rather the harms that we see algorithms causing in and around the continent. And I think with Ethiopia perhaps being the most consistent example of what that kind of failure looks like. That is definitely something that has to worry a lot of people as we go into the elections this year. Now, if I split the elections that are happening in Africa into perhaps those three, let's say two dominant regions. So you've got the elections happening in East and the Horn of Africa region. And then you've got the elections happening on the Francophone and Sahel region of Africa. Those are the two I really want to focus on because they have some very interesting and unique contexts, right? The first one that we worry about is, foreign interference, let's call it foreign interference, and specifically foreign actors trying to game the algorithms of these American and Chinese tech companies in order to push propaganda or hate speech or to sort of interfere with the civic debates that are happening within these specific countries. Now, in the Eastern / Horn of Africa region, for Kenya specifically, we've noticed that there have been far-right networks, which has been a subject of the latest piece of, or rather my latest piece of research that was released a few weeks ago, that there are far-right networks that have seen a lot of these big tech companies as huge conduits towards peddling influence to try and convince Kenyans to vote against candidates that they do not see to be pushing their sort of gender ideology ideas, right? Their gender ideology agendas, right? That has been one very big theme that we're seeing, and very many, or rather, we've noticed that there's a specific far-right group that has specifically said that the Kenyan election is a target of theirs for this year, and that there is evidence that they have been using big tech companies in order to try and meddle with, or rather, in order to peddle influence and to try to sort of manufacture outrage in order to convince Kenyans to vote a certain way. In Somalia, I think that they are still going through the process of trying to have their elections. The big question is, how is big tech going to deal with the fact that the Somalian diaspora has been spewing hate speech and trying to distribute that hate speech to the people within Somalia through the use of their algorithms? There has never been, there has not been any public announcement on record around how they are trying to deal with that problem, because that means that if I'm looking to try and understand hate speech in Somalia, I should not be looking at what's going on in Somalia. I need to be looking at what it looks like more broadly from around the world, right? In the Sahel region, we've got the situation between the Russians and the French. I think in the Sahel region in Francophone West Africa is where I think that it is very clear that the platforms are the new frontier of the latest scramble for Africa. The big question is, we constantly keep seeing Facebook taking down inauthentic coordinated behavior networks from Russia and from France on a very consistent basis within those two regions, within Francophone West Africa and within the Sahel. So my question now becomes, what are we going to do to create some systemic changes to keep this kind of interference from happening, especially as two countries within that region, Chad and Mali, go into their elections, because there have been very serious influence operations going on in there, which of course the big tech platforms algorithms have been pushing down the throats of those citizens. So, a lot is at stake. And big tech, I think these companies that make these algorithms simply need to step up and really pay attention to what is possible here.
I love some of those final points that you made on how these problems cross borders. You know, I think we've talked about now in each of your interventions, we've looked at different political situations and very local contexts, but there are a lot of commonalities across our different political systems and discourses. And not only are the techniques and strategies shared across borders, but I think the outcomes also have a huge amount of impact beyond the borders of any one single country. Odanga, you mentioned Russia right now, and I know that Russia, Ukraine is top of mind for a lot of folks who are reading international news now. And it's such a clear example of how the information ecosystem in one part of the world or in one specific country can suddenly, you know, have an outsized impact all in multiple countries and regions. We've at Mozilla done some research related to elections in the past couple of years. Specifically, we look most closely at the United States and at Germany. And out of that body of work, we came up with a list of requirements. We call them the minimum election standards. And part of what we were using that for was to target the big tech companies, the platforms, and come up with sort of a list of rules of things that you could demand of platforms before any major election somewhere in the world. And these are things like, you should be removing false content, or you should be promoting authoritative sources, or you should be working with local and regional stakeholders, providing adequate transparency, this sort of thing. I wanted to ask you all, what would you say is top of mind for you in terms of, and I can start with Samantha, what would you say is one of the most important things that needs to happen if you're thinking about big tech companies help us secure the minimum election standard?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You know, it's so hard to pick just one thing. I think there's a lot that can be done by tech companies still, and a lot that can be done better, especially when we're starting to put this picture of disinformation and election interference into the broader global landscape. For me, you know, I think the importance of working with local and regional stakeholders is huge. Having the person that's you know, local partners can write to and connect with or call up when a disinformation story is going viral is just so important for having that kind of rapid response to any kind of mis or disinformation campaign that's taking off in a very localized context. Platforms don't always necessarily have the staff on hand to be able to work in every kind of local language or dialect. And so having that connection point to local community and local partners on the ground, people who understand the cultural and political context of the country, I think is just so important. And I think, you know, that's for, you know, rapid response, short-term things that platforms can do. When we're thinking much more in the long term, I think there's also a growing need to work with these local partners, to work with academics and researchers, and to give them more data and more insight into what is actually happening on the platforms. We have very little insight into, you know, the algorithms, what people are seeing, what people are sharing on social media. And so it's very hard to actually know and measure the effects of these campaigns on individual behavior and on individual belief. And so starting to establish those more trusted networks, data sharing agreements that allow this kind of more long-term research to take place so that we can really fine-tune our policy recommendations and policy responses to these big problems, I think is incredibly important.
Thank you. Mohammed? Same question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and we try to think about it on and off. I mean, what comes to my mind is like also one point that Samantha mentioned is really about the rapid response. Like there has been like it's really a slow process, and it should be much faster, specifically when it comes to elections. because I mean, it should be a few hours, maybe a day. Now it's taking a month sometimes to solve a case. Not election related, but like also like an urgent case. So for what I think is that they should have like a bigger unit on these elections, even if it's on small countries, and they need to really look and follow and try to track any kind of disinformation campaign that's happening, because it's so easy to manipulate their softwares. So that is an issue. Another thing that's been discussed on the local level is more transparency on the expenditure of the candidates in terms of ads. So how much money they're spending per ads, because there's limits on how much money they can spend. And plus other pages that are actually supporting these candidates, because the candidate can spend, I don't know, $50,000 per election. Then if they have like $5,000 or $10,000 for Facebook ads or online ads, then we need to know how to get these numbers. Otherwise, they will be breaching the election law. So these 2 points come to mind quickly now on that question.
Odanga, I'm sure you have things you want to bring too.
Making it sound like I have things to get off of my chest. Well, what I would say is, I think we first of all need to start from a point of just genuine intent. To very many of these companies, this is beginning to look like it's just about making money and shipping it away and leaving the communities that you've affected unattended to. So I would first of all perhaps ask these guys to simply just care. Let's not operate with such a blatant kind of neglect for the communities that you work with. If we start from that really intrinsic motivation, hopefully then we will be able to see what is not just a patchwork of policies, but perhaps things that appear to be a bit more systemic and actually go to sort of fix the root cause of the problems that we are seeing. When it comes to elections, I think also it's very important that, again, speaking to the thread of around patchwork policies, is can we also have much earlier interventions? It shouldn't be that, I mean, as a Kenyan, I can tell you, this country has been in campaign mode since 2019. And probably we hit our highest peak of, or rather our campaign mode began hitting its peak in 2021, right? But up until that point, no platforms have even gone on record to talk about what kind of efforts and interventions they're going to be putting for our elections. None of them are going ahead to, go public on record about that. So there's no transparency. Even before we get to algorithmic transparency, in general, again, where is this intrinsic motivation to care for us, the people that use these platforms, right? Apart from, of course, selling our data to advertisers, right, and making money off of that. My question is, where is the intrinsic intention? Can you commit publicly instead of, one of the things I'll just say here is that, a lot of these platforms have been hosting sort of Chatham House rules meetings with civil society actors here in Kenya, and they tell us a whole bunch of nothing, right? And then they'll tell us Chatham House rules meetings, you can't talk about what we talked about in this meeting. But in reality, you've really not told us anything that you're gonna do, right? And so I'm all about intention. Even before we get to the AI part, I'm all about intention. That is something that clearly seems to be lacking amongst these platforms. Secondly, just transparency, and can they share, some of this data with outside researchers and independent researchers? Just again, I think, as Samantha mentioned, to sort of help us understand what kind of effects these platforms are having within our democratic ecosystems.
Thank you. Yeah. Mohammed, I was reminded of something you said earlier about you feel that the platforms are actually listening more and making a bigger investment in some areas. Can you explain what you meant by that? Have you also had Chatham House closed door meetings with platforms, or what gives you that impression?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I think all of us here on the call, maybe all the audience, have those kind of rules. They have been listening more, but I'm not sure. But the process from listening to actually acting is taking too much time. So we're not sure yet. I mean, we didn't see like elections in Tunisia didn't happen yet, or in Sudan. So we'll see what's actually going to happen. We're not expecting a lot, but it's a process. So we'll see. I mean, I'm not super optimistic, but I'm also not super pessimistic on this topic. Yeah, I mean, this has been an issue. And before that, I mean, I just quoted the head of policy in the MENA in 2014. And he was the first person who was appointed to work on policy, and he's from the region to the region. And that was in 2014, after the Arab Spring by like 3 years. So that's how slow things can get with tech companies.
Samantha, you're in Stanford, close to the heart of a lot of tech companies. I wonder if you have any particular insights. And I'm also curious if, a lot of what we're talking about is intent, investment, resources. I wonder also if you could touch on the technical aspect of this. Is it really that costly? Does it require such a big investment to just change how an algorithm works? Isn't there something that they could do just with the code?
Yeah, great questions. So, I think the points about like listening to action are really, really accurate. I think there is a lot more intent to listen and to get feedback, but then once that feedback kind of goes into actual practice, I think a lot of the platform responses really fall short because they don't necessarily get to this deeper problem around algorithms and the way that their business models can actually support and amplify mis and disinformation, right? When we look at the problem at the level of content, we're really missing this deeper picture of why disinformation goes viral in the first place. And a lot of it really has to do with the algorithms and with these kinds of ways that the systems are designed. Figuring out exactly how to tweak the algorithms so that they work better for democracy, I think is, going to be one of the biggest challenges when we're thinking about designing these systems for democracy. I don't necessarily have the answer myself, but, I think for starters, there's a bunch of things that could be done here. Right now, Silicon Valley is mostly male, mostly white engineers who are designing and optimizing these products for engagement and advertising revenue, bringing in more diverse processes into the design process, thinking about ethics, thinking about harm in different kinds of ways from different perspectives, I think is incredibly important when we're thinking about this from the design angle. And, once we have a more diverse group of people who are thinking about these technologies and thinking about these kinds of harms, hopefully that will come through the technology. But, I'm very much of the opinion that a lot of these things are also not just the technology. Like, of course, technology plays a huge role in spreading and amplifying mis and disinformation in the lead up to elections, but we also have to consider the human element of this as well, and the fact that people like to share disinformation, right? Narratives that use racism, sexism, misogyny, they tend to go much further and much farther because they speak to the status quo. And so they're popular ideas with a large group of people, right? And so tackling this challenge requires, of course, platform responses and reimagining the algorithms and the way that they promote and amplify information, but it also involves societal level approaches too.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we've gone around the globe and we're talking about these rogue governments and huge forces and, cultural forces that are greater than the internet itself. But I think one of the things, Odanga, that I really appreciate about your research, some of the recent work that you've done, is even though we're talking about big governments or powerful people, that some of the methods that they use are very low tech, actually, even though it's about gaming an algorithmic system. And I wonder, is it very costly or difficult to, for instance, influence the conversation on Twitter in Kenya?
Well, I think what you've mentioned is what even makes it more perplexing, right? That people who are supposedly supposed to be the smartest people in the world get duped by a bunch of have the algorithms get duped by a bunch of college kids in Nairobi, Kenya. I mean, that's not to say anything bad about the college kids in Nairobi, Kenya. But
maybe you could explain who are the college kids, like what is the kind of disinformation?
Exactly. So I'm getting to that because I mean, as you mentioned, it's when you look into these methods, they seem to be fairly simple. So for example, gaming Twitter's trending algorithm typically what they do is that they have a bunch of sock puppet accounts that tweet at a high volume, right? In order to sort of trick Twitter's trending algorithm into thinking a specific trending hashtag is garnering popularity amongst the people within that specific context. If I was to put it long and short, majority of it is about using a specific, or rather creating a certain amount of volume in order to trick that algorithm into thinking that a specific thing is popular. And oftentimes, if they are successful, they end up getting published on the trending section of Twitter. It does sound fairly simple. And every time I've interacted with the people that get paid to run these campaigns and to do these kind of, to do these kind of nefarious activities, it's more or less somewhere alongside the same sort of typology. Perhaps there'll be nuances sometimes where they will either wake up early in the morning when there's less activity on Twitter to try and, game the algorithm at that time. Or as we have highlighted before, some of them will actually rent out verified accounts from people who have managed to get their accounts verified in order to sort of get a larger audience of people to receive the message that they're trying to put out and hopefully get Twitter to publish their content onto the algorithm. But more or less, most of the time, it's about the volume, or rather tweeting in a very short burst, in a very specific high frequency volume to try and get Twitter's trending algorithm to pick up the thing. It's always been fairly simple, but my question to Twitter has always been, how have you guys never been able to figure this thing out, right? But anyway, that's a story for another day, but that's essentially what it looks like.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, because we talk about this as being artificial intelligence, and because it is technical and so much of it happens behind the scenes, it does sometimes feel like it's far more advanced techniques than it actually is. And Mohammed, I know that in the Middle East and North Africa, there's also been a lot of issues with automated content moderation and content takedowns, and that's a front that people face in many different languages. But I just wonder, like, are these systems, these automated systems, are they as intelligent as we're led to believe by the companies?
This is a very good question, because this is one issue that we've been suffering from, especially after ISIS, or what's so-called ISIS. There has been a lot of censorship for a lot of religious content. A lot of words are leading to content removal. We have seen in Palestine in May 2021, when Sheikh Jarrah happened, there has been a lot of censorship from Instagram and Facebook and other tech companies and TikTok on content that's supposed to be accepted speech, even for these companies. So definitely their processes and systems in place was really removing a lot of content when it comes to the Palestinian narrative. So I'm not sure. I mean, Facebook have apologized a few times back then, but yeah, I mean, there has been also some systematic what do you call it, like discrimination between against Palestinian. So this is something that we definitely put our finger on, and a lot of partners are now working on these issues specifically when it comes to the Palestine-Israel, because what we've seen now in Ukraine is it seems to be accepted norm, like but like on a much lower scale, the content that was happening in Palestine was removed and was considered sensitive, and there was a lot of content removal, downgrading of content, etc., etc. So this is happening a lot, and yeah, now we're trying to deal with it.
So sometimes it's a problem of too much content being removed. Sometimes it's a problem of too little content being removed. Samantha?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just to add to this, I think thinking about these kinds of like automated technological solutions is like very like technological solutionism, and I think we can barely already moderate content at scale using these technical systems in English, which is like the dominant language that a lot of these models have been trained on. There are so many examples of bias, of over censorship, of error, of harm happening as a result of these systems in the English language already, and so rolling that out around the world in the hundreds, the thousands of different dialects that are out there, so that it's meaningful and doesn't actually lead to over censorship or harm or bias, I think is just like, it would be magic. And so again, I think when we're thinking about these systems and the way that they moderate and govern our information ecosystem, like, yes, they're important, but we also really need to consider the human element too, in terms of what platforms are doing. And there really just isn't enough done, like even on the human front. Content moderators work in really harsh conditions. They're not always able to unionize. They don't get support. They work at very, very low wages, and they are constantly exposed to incredibly harmful, mentally damaging content, right? So even starting there and building up the more human side of content moderation to deal with a lot of these issues, I think is really, really important.
I would agree. Have any of you seen any successful examples of that? Like thinking in the realm of solutions, anybody who's pioneered that in any field, whether it be political or health related, or like what does good local engagement look like for the companies?
I can jump in here. So at Stanford, we ran kind of two partnerships. We had the Election Integrity Partnership and the Virality Project. And here we worked with local stakeholders, academics, various kind of local government health agencies for the Virality Project to track mis and disinformation in real time in the lead up to elections. And we had platform partners who were part of this process. And so we could report to them in real time narratives that were emerging throughout in the lead up to and like after the election and during the ongoing COVID pandemic. And I think this is a really useful model for thinking about how to bring together different kinds of actors across civil society, across academia, having platform involvement that can be present for that kind of real rapid response. Yeah, I think this would be a really kind of great model and something that people could potentially look to roll out in their own country contexts in the lead up to an election or some other kind of event that's drawing a lot of disinformation narratives.
Thank you.
I also want to share, like, it's been like a few months since we launched Arab Alliance for Digital Rights. And as an alliance, we're trying to speak with the companies. I think this is becoming more and more useful I also believe like these issues take time. I mean, these issues take time in terms of like just like identifying the issues, trying to find where we can create some change, etc., etc. So it's still baby step, but it's moving forward.
And what about in the realm of research, knowing that we're not anywhere near to having the transparency that we need from big social media companies? What are research efforts that you've seen in different parts of the world and working in different languages that have really impressed you in terms of the ability to make an impact?
I think I can step in here. I think there's actually a recent effort, I think, by the Harvard Shorenstein Center called the Facebook fbarchive.org, where they are sort of planning to release internal documents from Facebook, but also to people from all over the world who might be interested in doing research based off of these papers, or rather to be able to have access to them. Of course, that is not through the will of the company itself, Facebook, but I think it's one very decent research collaboration that, you know, recognizes that there are many people that maybe need access to these kind of documents. And, you know, especially after many people complained that with the initial release of the Facebook papers that, you know, many of us in the global south and in other African countries, you know, didn't necessarily get a chance to also look into these and understand what they meant for us. So I very much commend what those guys are doing in terms of increasing the accessibility to this kind of work. I think I've also seen Twitter did release some of their own internal research into how they're trying to combat the harms that their platform is doing. I can't remember the exact details of that, but I did see that at least they're putting in some effort towards trying to, you know, openly and transparently collaborate with people from, or rather with researchers from outside. I also think that Facebook's partnership with the DFR Lab, at least the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab, and with a whole bunch of other fact checkers across the world, is actually still very commendable, because it's actually teaching us a lot about how you know, how these platforms are manifesting within our local context. So I would say those three are very big things and big steps, definitely, in terms of moving forward.
Samantha, Mohammed?
I don't have much to add here. You know, I think just re-emphasizing the platform data that is available. I think, you know, the fact that platforms do release some data, particularly around like the coordinated and authentic behavior, the Twitter takedowns, and their transparency reports are a really, really positive step. This isn't to say that there aren't problems with the data that is released. There's still a lot of questions. As researchers, we could still use more and better insight. But, you know, I think it's a really good first start. When it comes to the Facebook side, you know, I think there's a whole nother can of worms with their current CrowdTangle initiatives that have currently been placed on hold. So no new researchers can join the CrowdTangle platform. And there's kinds of like questions as to what's going to actually happen with these kinds of, with this data sharing platform and what its future is going to be. Because of, I think, big scandals like Cambridge Analytica and the misuse of Facebook data, I think this kind of you know, the idea of privacy is sometimes weaponized to prevent access to the data that researchers really need to get a real clear understanding of the actual impact that these kinds of things are having on citizens and on democracies. There are definitely models and like ways that we could facilitate data sharing in a way that respects user privacy and, you know, facilitates greater research. And I think a lot more work kind of needs to be done to push platforms in that direction, whether the pressure comes from the bottom up or from the top down through various kind of government regulations.
Yeah, it's one of the first times that we've actually mentioned government regulations and the role of government to help with some of this as well. Mohammed, do you have anything around policy that you would encourage?
Oh, well, when it comes to policy, I think more transparency on some of their policies in the region. There has been a lot of application of some of their policies, but it's not been public. So this is also one of the issues that we're asking as well. Also, one of the things that we think should happen is allowing entities who are representative in the different parliamentaries in the region to be presented on Facebook. They have listed a lot of entities as terrorists just because they exist on the US list, but they can't prevent that. So yeah, there's like a different set of things, like on a smaller scale as well, that they need to do. Also, like the relationship with the Gulf. It's for us, it's still kind of like interesting and weird at the same time that tech companies that we think of them or many people think of them as protecting of free speech. Now it can be a joke, this sentence, are actually based in the Gulf, are based in UAE and soon maybe in Saudi Arabia, because in this country they don't have elections. There's no personal rights, political rights. I mean, there's a lot of oppression. So we're really not sure how the regional offices exist in these countries as well.
Yeah. And that is perhaps also something worth saying in the context of politics, is that we still depend on social media so much for a lot of the good speech that happens and the positive organizing, and that we really need these systems to be open and accessible and safe for everybody, for the sake of the information ecosystem. You can each have final thoughts if there's anything more you want to share. We're nearing the end. Any last thing you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, I think one thing that maybe just to build off of what you guys have said is, we need these platforms to survive, right? We need them to thrive. We need them to remain, or rather to be around, because I think people love these platforms, people love using them. People, this is how they gain a lot of civic education. It's how they meet their wives, their future wives, there's, except maybe the Tinder swindler case, but, it's something that's very much tied to how we want to live our lives, or rather how we live our lives. And so for me, I think even in terms of policy, is that number one, African governments have an incredible record of coming up with excellent policies, but a terrible record in terms of executing those policies. So even for me, in my position, politically speaking, policies don't feel like the answer. I still put the pressure back on the social media platforms, because I do believe that they have more opportunities to counter such kinds of influence operations through their platform policies than governments actually do through existing legislation. So we do have to think about, they have to recognize that they bear a very immense task, and they need to adequately, first of all, they need to accept that, and then, have the intrinsic motivation and care for the users that they have at heart, and thirdly, invest accordingly.
One thing that comes to mind is some regulations inside the US, because this is really going to affect all the globe. At least like the privacy law, more transparency on the algorithms, etc., etc. I mean, at the same time, I'm supportive of regulation inside the US on these companies, because we kind of trust that these laws are going to be better than no laws. But at the same time, I don't trust that any regulation in our region is going to be in a positive step. It's always going to affect users in a negative way. So that's why I think having some laws and regulations inside the US, kind of similar to what is happening with GDPR in the EU, is protective to all users around the globe.
Yeah, I think for my closing remarks, I'd again, I think like to emphasize that disinformation and the disinformation that we see during elections is really a symptom of much deeper problems within our societies and within our democracies. And so any of the measures that we take targeting platforms and these kind of more technical solutions need to also be complemented with much more long-term solutions that build resiliencies within our democracy and how citizens participate in our digital ecosystem. These really need to complement these policy and technical solutions that, of course, also need to be implemented to make our digital public sphere safe and secure and a place that everybody can participate in equally.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that sentiment of it's not just the short term, it's the long term, it's not just the local, it's the entire information ecosystem. I think elections afford us, they give us momentum. You know, there are moments in time where you can sort of use that momentum to push for change. And I think in that way, elections are helpful to think about from a campaigning aspect and from a collaboration aspect with others, and something that is, I think, recognizable from one place to another in a way that the individual, like political system or cultural system or language, or like we have so many differences, but this moment of an election is something that we can sort of relate to each other on. So anybody who's watching, please stay in touch with us, with Mozilla, with the speakers here. I want to say thank you. I want to say tune in tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time or 4 p.m. Central European Time for a conversation about education in a mixed AI reality. That was your ad for MozFest. And keep an eye out on our Twitter at Mozilla Festival, where we'll be announcing future dialogues and debate panels just like this one, and other great things that are happening at MozFest this week. A final thank you to Zaina Abiasi, Kevin Zawaki, Mark Walsh, Marisa Gomez-Adams, Andy Kochendorfer, Khan Guyen, Alex Arce, and again, our fantastic panelists. This was really very, very interesting. Thank you so much for the work you do, and take care, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.